This video is brought to you by Captivating History. The 1920s looms large in the public's popular imagination as a glamorous era of technological change and widespread prosperity. Bookended by two world wars and the Great Depression, the period during the 20s was an oasis of peace, which emerged between a series of global calamities. The Roaring Twenties were regarded as a golden age because of the mass culture that molded new wills among Americans in the 1920s. The booming economy and political reforms of this time period were well known, with more relaxed social attitudes made the 20s a grand time to party, while economic growth during this era was ultimately built on sand. After the horrific events of the First World War came to a close in 1980, the mood across Europe and America was one of renewed positivity. Almost 20 million people had died in the war, and shortly afterward, 10 million more had been killed by the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 through 1920. With these dark events fading into the past and many novel inventions and forms of entertainment now available, the future looked bright for many. Radios were purchased, cinemas were open, newspapers and magazines were sold. During this magnificent era, all forms of mass media were developed. They were not only pleasure devices, but they also helped to propagate popular culture. Some people believe that the media is inappropriate and causes children to become addicted to everyday entertainment. It is undeniable that the extensive use of mass media during the 1920s, such as movies, radios, newspapers, and magazines, had a huge impact on people's values and perspective across the country. The radio was brought into play by mass media in the 1920s.
For the first time, radio transmission connected millions of individuals all over the world. People gathered at home around the country to listen to their radios, broadcast news, entertainment, and popular music, such as jazz, were among the programs. The most famously known broadcast show during this time period was called KDKA, featured for news and talk radio format. It is considered by many historians as the first commercially licensed radio station. The radio was considered a good thing for most people because of the greater economy created. However, the advance of radio technology also created a tension between old and new traditions of Americans.
In the 1920s, people had more time to read for enjoyment. Mass-market magazines became more popular than ever. The colorful publications told people about news, fashion, sports, and hobbies.
Advertisers used flashy ads in magazines and newspapers to sell consumer products. The content of these publications offered creating fast or temporary fashions and way of acting. Magazines and newspapers helped to shape the culture of the era. The earliest of the mass media was the newspaper, which brought information and opinion to its readers. But the earliest newspapers were not intended for the mass. The newspaper and magazine became a very popular sort of communication for people to stay updated. As the writers and editors learned how to hook readers in, creating thrilling stories in the tabloids, more people became interested in what they had to say.
We will talk about the changes first. The first thing is, many Americans began to emphasize science and secular values over traditional ideas about religion. Second, women's attitudes and roles began to change. And the last one is immigrants who moved to the United States, bringing a diverse mix of people and ideas. Then the next one is about the effect.
Science and religion clash when a high school teacher, John Scopes, broke a Tennessee law by teaching Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. The fashions of women who were known as flappers were popularized in movies and magazines. More importantly, these women believed that they had the same social and political rights as men.
Then the third one is about the immigration. Once very open to people from Eastern and Southern Europe, immigration was limited to quotas. New legislation limited immigration from certain countries. The Ku Klux Klan, which terrorized African Americans, was revived. So we will talk a little bit more about the flappers of the 1920s. They were young women who were known for energetic freedom, embracing a lifestyle viewed by many at the time as outrageous, immoral, or downright dangerous. But now, they were considered the first generation of independent American women. Next, we will talk about how women's rights changed in the 1920s. Women's suffrage or voting claimed that women are not the equal of men mentally, and being able to vote would take them out of their proper sphere of life. On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, enfranchising all American women.
It took nearly 100 years to win the right to vote for women, known as women's suffrage in the United States. This agreement overstretched threatened to cripple the movement more than once. The campaign for women's suffrage was a small but growing movement in the decade before the Civil War. Starting in the 1820s, various reform groups proliferate across the U.S.
They redefined young women with short hairstyles, cigarettes dangling from their painted lips, dancing to a live jazz band, exploring newfound freedoms.
And yet, the legacy of 19th Amendment, in the short term and over the next century, turns out to become declared. It advanced equality between the sexes, but left intersecting inequalities of class, race, and ethnicity intact.
In terms of politics, women had some success in increasing their role. Next, their biggest achievement was getting the vote.
Organizations such as the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, had been campaigning for decades to get the vote for women, but it was not until 1920 that the 19th Amendment to the Constitution gave women the right to vote.
The last one is they had taken on new types of jobs. For example, factory work, when they replaced the men who had gone to fight.
It became acceptable for women to drive cars and take part in the energetic sport. It was all the rage for women to cut their hair in a bob. Beauty salons spread across America.
Women started to smoke and drink in public and to go out without chaperones, all of which would have been frowned upon before the war.
They wore clothing more suited to an active life. They stopped wearing corsets. Skirts became shorter. In 1919, women's skirts were about 6 inches above ground level, but by 1927, the hem skirts were up to knee level. Women found their life changed in more than appearance. However, society now accepted that women could be independent and make their choice for themselves in education, jobs, marital status and careers.
To begin with, jazz was one of the most memorable inventions in the Roaring Twenties. Not only is it musically, culturally, and aesthetically valuable, but it has a host of positive impacts on American societies as well. Secondly, the etymology of the word jazz has been researched and concluded that it must somehow have been related to a slang term, jazzin, which was widely adopted in 1860. The word jazzums refers to pep energy. Thirdly, jazz is a combination of African American and European American musical parentage, rooted in some kinds of music like blues and ragtime. It has been recognized as a major form of musical expression in traditional and popular music, linked by the common bonds of African American and Anglo American musical parentage. Jazz is characterized by swing and blue notes, complex chords, call and response vocals, polyrhythms, as well as improvisation. It also has roots in European harmony and African rhythmic visuals. Fourthly, jazz originated in the African American communities of New Orleans, Louisiana, United States, in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. Fifthly, in the early 20th centuries, it became one of the elements in pop culture. Moreover, starting in an African community, jazz nonetheless began to spread to other parts of New Orleans and thereafter throughout the States and other parts of the world. Sixthly, jazz became prevalent in other parts of the globe. In Thailand, for instance, jazz constitutes one of the genres that the former king, King Rama IX, had a preference for and composed a number of musical works. Jazz was introduced to Paris during the World War I when the U.S. Army regiments brought African American soldiers to serve in France. Between the wars, jazz remained popular as a symbol of opposition to colonialism, and jazz singers such as Joseph Baker rose to fame. Other styles and genres of jazz that emerged in the 2000s are Latin and Afro-Cuban jazz. Afro-Cuban is the earliest form of Latin jazz. It mixes Afro-Cuban clave-based rhythms with jazz harmonies and techniques of improvisation. Afro-Cuban jazz emerged in the early 1940s with the Cuban musicians Mario Bauza and Frank Giulio Machito in the band Machito and his Afro-Cubans in New York City. Last but not least, jazz has impacts on both race and religion in conjunction with gender equality. As it was invented by African American, it drew some attention to these people in terms of their contributions to culture and history. Although not perfect, it optimally rewards some respect and admiration to these people, thereby resulting in some more apparent equality. Jewish Americans play a significant role in jazz. As it spread, it developed to encompass many different cultures, and the work of Jewish composers in Tin Pan Alley helped shape the many different sounds that jazz came to incorporate. For example, in the concert by The Goodman, Boots Eder regarded it as the single most important jazz or popular music concert in the history. Now, let's talk about another important event starting in the period of Roaring Twenties. Apparently, it's Old Hollywood. It was largely set in the 1920s to 1960s. Despite no formal set of stages, it transitioned to the following era. It's considered to be the oldest film industry in the sense of being the place where the earliest film studios and production companies emerged. It's also the birthplace of various genres of cinemas. There are 5 components of its characteristics. First, business rather than art. This is also known as the era of major studios and large corporations focusing on business and money rather than art, which is core the studio system. Second, producer over director. Total dominance over the film production belongs to producer. Third, the film studios control filmmaking, film distribution, film exhibition, and their own theater. Fourth, the films were controlled by the production code that required the studios to censor themselves. And fifth, the films were formulaic and cliché. They were pure entertainment value, promoting American values such as optimism, individualism, toughness, and presenting a mostly conservative morality. Following the Roaring Twenties, there was a great economic crisis known as the Depression. It was a severe worldwide economic depression that took place mostly during the 1930s, beginning in the United States. The timing of the Great Depression varied around the world. In most countries, it started in 1929 and lasted until the late 1930s. It was the longest, deepest, and most widespread depression of the 20th century. The Great Depression is commonly used as an example of how intensely the global economy can decline. The Great Depression started in the United States after a major fall in stock prices that began around September 4, 1929, and became worldwide news with the stock market crash of October 29, 1929, which was known as Black Tuesday. Between 1929 and 1932, worldwide gross domestic product, or GDP, fell by an estimated 15%. By comparison, worldwide GDP fell less than 1% from 2008 to 2009. For this reason, many people were extremely stressed, and something was needed to terminate this problem. As a result, there were numerous movies developed in response to the Great Depression. They were incredibly successful. As most people were unhappy in those days, the film needed to be optimistically presented to increase happiness, resulting in 3 aforementioned values: optimism, toughness, and individualism.
You have to answer 2 questions. 1. Name one change in Roaring 20. In 2. What did a typical flapper look like?